So we have a Q&A session now for the next 20 minutes approximately, and we're going to hand it over to you, the Citizens Assembly, to pose questions to Dr. Mark Callanan. So over to you. Table 3. If you just announce yourselves, please, and pose the question. Thanks.
Maria Quill, Table 3. I'm just wondering, Mark, you were talking there about devolving power, but example, the local authority already has the planning function, but the government passed a motion or a law anyway last year that once a planning application was over 100 plus units, it went straight from Bord Planola. Like, how would you counter that if you know, that's a direct attack from central government on local government? How would you see that panning out?
Yep. So thanks for that question. You know, you're right. I mean, things have moved. I mean, there are other examples as well of things that have moved from the local to the national level in recent years. I suppose that was probably a decision based on the idea that we need to speed up the planning process. And going back to the arguments for a national approach, you know, a national approach means, you know, a clear focus for decision making, maybe a streamlined approach to decision making. And I suppose the government of the day felt that was appropriate given the circumstances we're in. Whether that will bear out in terms of an improved approach to the planning process in the long term, I think is probably more debatable. And if things can be thrashed out at that more localised level, you might in the long run get better quality decisions. But look, that's a sort of a consideration that government at the time, I presume, tried to weigh up and felt, you know, on balance it was better to make large developments go straight to the national level. So I suppose it goes back to those sort of standard arguments, you know, what are sort of certain things maybe are appropriate for a more national approach, other things maybe less appropriate. I have my doubts myself whether that in the long run that will work, whether that'll be a sustainable approach, but who's to say, you know.
Thanks for the question, Maria. Table 5, please.
Nicole O'Connor, Table 5. I suppose our question is, what considerations were made when deciding the balance between allocation of resources between local and centralised services, and are the results of these decisions monitored?
So these are based for financial decisions, these are financial allocations and things like that?
Financial and the staffing kind of across.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that would be monitored. I mean, the financial allocations would be monitored on an ongoing basis, you know, through things like the audit process and reviews, and there's a specific body responsible for monitoring financial issues within the local government sector, the National Oversight and Audit Commission. So that would be subject to ongoing external assessment. The financing system is complex enough, but it might have had, again, you're probably going to get a little bit more of that, I think, later on, either today or tomorrow. But there's a balance there between national allocations and then, if you like, own resources, things that are raised locally through commercial rates and local property tax and service charges. So the national approach to allocations is sort of broken down to, you know, capital allocations, broadly speaking, around, you know, if there's big projects taking place in a particular locality, that would be reflected in capital allocations around things like social housing building programs or infrastructure projects. And then the sort of the more general grant allocation, there's a whole set of criteria that go into that around population levels and service demands in different fields. But it is subject to ongoing allocations and personnel numbers, I suppose, ultimately through the Department of Housing and ultimately through the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in terms of staffing levels. And I suppose there is I suppose as a follow-up to that question, there's an obvious implication both for staffing levels and financial allocations that would have to go with any kind of devolution. So I think that's something that logistically can happen. You know, nowadays we've got good data, much better data in terms of financial management than we had in the past around the cost of providing a particular service. And the staffing implications of providing a particular service. So those kind of logistical implications can be worked out. I think it's more about, I suppose, I'd see it in terms of the work of the Assembly, what's appropriate for decision making at a more localised level. But I think those logistical things can be fleshed out, you know, on foot of any decision to devolve functions into the future.
Thanks, Mark. Just a reminder, the facilitators, they can use the Google Docs there if they want to upload any questions to be asked. So we've one from table 9 and Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie. What were the reasons that the suggestions from the 1990s were not implemented for local government?
I'm afraid I don't have any insider knowledge on that. I suppose I could hazard a guess that it was a kind of a mix of political factors, in which case I might defer to the next speaker. Follow me, and maybe administrative factors as well. That, you know, that politicians who make their way to the cabinet table, the long and arduous journey to the cabinet table, once they get there, are usually fairly reluctant to sort of give away responsibility for certain areas of service provision. There have been exceptions to that, by the way, but lots of politicians are quite happy to keep what they have, and similarly, officials maybe working within departments and agencies are also maybe reluctant to give away responsibility for things. That's my best guess at an answer, but there are others who might be able to speak to that point.
Well handled, Mark. Now, table 11, Kriya.
Hi, my name is Griya. I'm table 11. Our question was, how do we safeguard against privatisation taking powers away from local government if powers were devolved? Because we were just struck by, like, for example, the outsourcing of waste management to private companies, or kind of the transfer of powers to Irish Water. So we're just interested to learn about that.
Yeah, I think regardless of devolution, there has been a trend in not just in Ireland, but in other parts of the world as well, that certain things have become more outsourced or contracted out, maybe use a less loaded phrase, and that would include devolved services in other jurisdictions. So I mentioned, for example, the Helsinki example, the public transport system, which is run through a collection of local authorities that make up the greater Helsinki area, and that operates on the basis of a combined direct provision service but also a regulated private service. But the local government system retains the regulatory role, so it has overall responsibility for not just roads but also the wider public transport system, either through direct provision but also through its regulatory powers in terms of licensing and things like that. So devolution can take the form of the regulatory role as well as direct provision. There can be, and different cities have taken different approaches to those kinds of things. They've made their decisions based on the circumstances that exist in their area. So, ultimately, again, that would be, you would think that that's a decision for elected office holders to take, including if it was a mayoral office, to sort of make those kinds of decisions, whether it's direct provision or outsourcing or contracted services.
Thanks, Kriya. Great question. Over to table 1, please. Luke.
Hi, Mark, and thanks for the presentation. Our question is, if tomorrow all powers were to be devolved, would that be possible? And then what would stop that from happening if not?
Well, all powers, that's a lot. That's a big sweeping, category there, but it could be unusual. So I mean, if we're talking about a suite of powers, yeah, there would be a logistical exercise. I think, you know, it would not be a simple exercise to carry out. I think I've been involved, for example, in, you know, things like boundary reviews and sort of reallocating staff and services from one organisation to another. That is not a simple exercise. There are lots of logistical issues that go with that. But if the political will is there, it can be done. It can be done. It's not, and it won't happen tomorrow either. It wouldn't happen very, very quickly. It might be a project based. You know, you'd be talking about a transitional set of arrangements. But I think if the will is there to do that, it can be done. The logistics can be taken care of. So there are logistical barriers, I suppose, to sort of get to that sort of second part of your question. There are logistical issues and challenges that would go with any kind of devolution of responsibility. And then there's the actually act of deciding to do it. We're going to make this happen, which is, you know, in itself not an easy thing. You know, there are often defenders of the status quo that exist in, you know, in different organisational environments, that will want to sort of keep the current arrangements as there are. So I think that's another hurdle. I mean, just to give, just by way of an example, I mentioned the last reform programme from 2012, the Putting People First local government reform programme. And as part of that exercise, there was a sort of a canvassing of departments and national agencies, asking them what are the things that we could devolve to the local government system. So this is back in sort of 2011, 2012. And the list that they came up with was things like smaller tourist information offices, flood defences, and allocating bus stops and where bus stops should be. So without wanting to be too dismissive, right, that was not the most ambitious list that that you could come up with. And so what that says to me is that departments and agencies are unlikely to give away much on their own bat. It'll require, you know, a sustained political will to do it, you know. And if the will is there to do it, it can be done. So, you know, but that's what that says to me, you know. So again, there are hurdles at different junctures, you know, and barriers at different junctures. Not a reason for this group not to suggest doing something, right? So just maybe it's not necessarily a reason not to suggest something, but yeah, there are challenges for sure.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Luke. Next, table 10, and Kathy.
Hi, Mark. Question for table 10 here. You noted 3 different models, 2 being the local government model of Helsinki and Amsterdam, and 1 being a centralised one of Auckland. In your opinion, as Ireland's leading expert, which worked best? And which do you feel would be more suitable for Dublin?
Thanks for that difficult question. I suppose I took them as comparators, as I say, based on large cities in small states. So I sort of said maybe these are sort of valid comparators. I think there's no place out there that sort of feels that we cracked the nut here. Everything is perfect, you know. Even in places like Finland, you know, people talk about the Swedish or the Finnish health model. As I understand it, people give out about healthcare in Sweden, and people give out about healthcare in Finland and things like that. So there's no place that you could sort of say that's the ideal to aspire to. I think it's just more about opening our minds to sort of thinking, actually, you know, the capital cities in smaller size states actually can do more, and often do more, and it seems to work relatively well. So, you know, a lot of people would talk about sort of the Nordic model maybe as a useful one to look at. You know, Ireland is not Finland, right? So, you know, this is again another basic fact of life. You know, we're not identical. Situation is slightly different. Our history is different. But there are some similarities, I think, between the two systems that, you know, might give us a way of sort of thinking a little bit differently about the things that could be devolved. So I haven't given a direct answer which is the best of the 3, as you'll probably notice. it's, as I understand, my job here, Chair, isn't to give my opinion more. It's to sort of present how do they do it elsewhere, and let you to make your own decisions around what you think might be most appropriate for Dublin. But those are some options, you know.
Thanks, Dr. Callanan. That is correct, yeah. Ultimately, the Citizens' Assembly, they will decide what's best suited for Dublin. But we do appreciate your opinions, and I think we're mature enough to reflect on that, so thank you. Over to table 6, please, and Jacqueline.
Hi, question from table 6. How might it look like? How might a breakdown look like? When the transfer of power, we say for education or policy, would go from central government to the local government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I in the slides, I suppose I've just put in sort of headline kind of issues. So it's take an issue like education, and I know we're going to be thrashing out some of these in a little bit more detail later today. But the extent of responsibility in education, again, can be different in different jurisdictions. So usually at a minimum, in jurisdictions where the local level might have a responsibility around education, it would usually extend at a minimum to planning for schools around demographic change, things like that, but also the maintenance of school buildings, for example. So the asset management task around school buildings and refurbishment and things like that. But in many jurisdictions, it might also extend to dispersing allocations to school boards, and maybe even deciding on allocations to individual school boards at that localised level. It can also extend to the employment of teachers, the recruitment and employment of teachers. So again, there's a sort of an extent of responsibility within the schools and education system that can vary from country to country. It's again, sort of putting up education as one responsibility is a bit simplistic, because actually there are different dimensions of the education system that you could look at in terms of you know, issues that might be candidates for devolution. I mean, if I can give you one, again, a more operational example, Ireland operates with one national school building and school refurbishment budget, which has been decentralised. It's in Tullamore, right? So the officials, the civil servants in the Department of Education that run the budget for school, whether you're a school in Clonakilty in West Cork, or in Donegal, or in inner city Dublin, wherever it is, there's one budget for school buildings in the whole country. That's a very unusual way internationally of running school buildings, you know, and more often than not, you might be making decisions at the more localised level. You know, how much refurbishment do we want to do on school buildings in our area? You know, what's going to be the cost of that? What implications does that have in terms of local taxes? So you get sort of that decision making at a more localised level. So that's like, we're unusual. You know, I think Dermot Scally at your last weekend saying we're outliers. We are outliers in some of these things. You know, that's an unusual way to run a school building programme. But it's what we've grown up with. We're used to it, right? So that's just the way we've gotten used to that system.
We've got 6 minutes to go. Thanks again, facilitators, for putting your questions in. Just to remind you to maybe just put in brackets the name of the person, please, the name of the assembly member. Thank you. Go to table 7, please, and Brian.
Mark, question, you've probably covered a good bit of it already, but when we looked at the chart that you presented with Switzerland at the top, and a small percentage of their people being employed by central government, and down the other end you had Ireland, where 90% were employed by central government, and you did explain to us that that did include teachers and guards and everybody worked for the HSE, etc. But is there a similar country somewhere in the middle who may have gone through the same change process that we're here to deliberate on? And if they did, then how long did that take, and what was the structure before and after?
Yeah, could look at a couple of examples. Again, at similar sized states. So you could look at, particularly, I suppose, a couple of obvious candidates would have been, countries in Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War, for example, embarked on processes of, so they ran sort of centrally planned, economies as well as administrative systems and approach to service areas. And one of the first things that they did was to try to devolve more responsibilities to the local and regional level. So I suppose that's a group of countries that that sort of embarked on that process, and it is a sort of an international theme in a lot of case studies around things like public service reform. There's this tend towards devolution, or in other jurisdictions they call it decentralization, but devolving responsibility for decision making around to the local and regional level. So I mean there are lots of different case studies you can look at. I always think looking abroad is useful for inspiration and getting ideas, but I think we have to also think about, we have a legacy here in Ireland, we have a traditional way of doing things. Ireland is not exactly the same as any other part of the world, but I think we can certainly get ideas from looking at these examples for sure, yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I found that chart really interesting as well. Very good, Mark. So the final question in this session, we're over to back to table 3, and Paddy.
Hi, Mark. Our question is, if powers were devolved to Dublin local authorities, do you think that rural constituencies would suffer financially, given that they would have to be, self-financing, or would keep a lot of their own wealth within that constituency?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there would always have to be some. The generic phrase that's used internationally is some equalisation mechanism to sort of reflect a weaker resource base in certain parts of the country. So depending on where local authorities get their own resources, you'd have certain areas that have a stronger revenue base, others with a weaker revenue base. And there's no, again, to draw on international examples, there's no system in the world that's entirely self-financing, and nearly every system around the world has some form of national redistribution of funds. Now it's done in different ways. There's lots of different ways in which that can be done. But as a principle, there's always some rebalancing. So if, for example, the local government system is reliant on property taxes, like commercial rates and local property tax, things like that, you're obviously going to have a healthier revenue base in urban areas versus rural areas. And there'll always be some role for redistribution of resources at national level. But again, I think that can be accommodated in a way that's fair. Fair is a difficult word around equalisation, because they're always controversial, because some people, if they create winners and losers, some people win from the equalisation system and some people lose when you're moving money around. So they're always controversial, but as a principle, I think they're always part of the package in terms of how local government systems work. So I think those differences can be accommodated and reflected, in terms of any decisions that you want to make.
Great. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your presentation this morning and your answers. Thanks for the facilitators for giving the questions. We've got through 9 questions there. Some of the questions that you proposed, we're keeping them for our guest speakers, and all the questions will be available to see what's been asked. But myself and Art are trying to do our best to have a fair representation of the questions that have been asked. So please, once again, give a big round of applause to Dr. Mark Callanan. Thank you, Mark.